All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben. I'm one of the core adjudication panels for PIDC 2025. First of all, I'd like to apologize for the poor camera quality as I'm still trying to sort out the lighting situation in my room. But anyway, this is my lecture specifically on first speaking in AP. Because there are quite a few differences with the way you do first speaking in BP versus AP because of the whole dynamics of the format. But a lot of the tips that will be given in this lecture should also be applicable towards BP, but this is more specifically tailored towards AP. So this lecture in specific is really more on tips that I see a lot of first speakers have problems with, common mistakes, and then what are the tips that perhaps I could share that could alleviate the common mistakes that we make. So if you're looking for a more comprehensive guide on how do you do first speaking, I'm sure there are um, plenty of lectures and videos that are present on YouTube that you could check out. But for this one, I think it's more specifically about what are the things that you could improve on as a continuing first speaker. And maybe some things that you could work on if you're an intermediate or someone who's just starting out, no? What are the things that you could work towards? Um, so let's start with what is the most basic expectation for a first speaker in AP. And we're going to be very technical here. Let's base it on, the main manual of AP debating, which is the UADC 2025 manual, which has just recently been updated by the cap of UADC. No? But according to the manual, a first speaker should. So a first speaker is both the prime minister and the leader of opposition for those who are simply starting out with debate. But PM and LO should, for PM, set up the stance, context, and the definitions of the debate, outline the policy or model if the debate is a policy debate, and provide arguments in favor of the motion. And for LO is simply the flip side of what the PM does. You set up the clash or counter policy if it is necessary, especially in a policy debate. But setting up the clash is quite necessary because it's what makes you different from your government team. You should accept or reject the definitions and or the context that the prime minister sets if it is necessary. Note that if it is necessary because if a definition or if a context is workable and debatable for both sides of the debate, then you have no reason to raise a definitional challenge. Because again, according to the manual, definitional challenge should be explicitly stated and should only be launched if the debate is unfair or if the definitions that the prime minister runs is one that cannot be debated objectively. So if it is workable, there's absolutely no reason for you to be able to do so. But you can contend things like characterizations and frames. That is completely up to the debate. But as for definitions, we need to refer to the rules and the proceedings of debating. Third is rebut the arguments of the prime minister. So responses and provide arguments against the motion. Basically, if you were to boil it down to its most simple form, the main role of a first speaker in AP is to simply get the content out. The most important content in a team should already come out at prime minister or leader of opposition. That includes the framing, that includes the model, that includes the characterization, and that includes the most direct, the most obvious, and the most impactful arguments in the debate, right? You need to have the discipline to manage your time to get all of those things out at your speech already. And this is where the first common mistake of first speakers, especially I think leader of opposition, right? Often, because we are overwhelmed with the content that comes from the first speaker, we would tend to allocate too much time responding to the extent that we lose out on time building and getting the content out that is necessary for a team to win. And you need to have the discipline to know what are the most urgent things that we need to respond to, and what are other arguments that we can perhaps let our deputies or whips respond to instead. You don't have to respond to every single argument, because the most important thing for you to do as the first speaker is to just simply get the arguments out. And this is a common mistake that I fell victim to for so long, because I thought that I had to be responsive in order to be engaging. But if that means that you don't run the arguments, then that completely defeats the purpose and you don't get to fulfill the role as the first speaker, no? So that's quite important. But in specific, or if you were to have perhaps a main goal as the first speaker, what should that main goal be? Right? How do you know that you fulfill your role as the first speaker? In my opinion, the most important thing that a first speaker should do, and the most important consideration that you should make, especially in Asian parliamentary, where case consistency, that is to say, are there contradictions in your case? And case evolution, that is to say, is there a development that happens in the case that exists in your team? If those things are necessary in order for you to win rounds in an AP tournament, your top of mind should be first time right. And first time right is a term that I simply just borrowed from operations management and manufacturing. But essentially, first time right is a goal that we set to ourselves to ensure that we don't make any time consuming and expensive adjustments down the line. So in arguments, you should get it the first time right. Um, Basically, there's minimal need for corrections and adjustments later on. Meaning, you ensure, in specific to debate, ensuring that the model and the arguments that you create in prep already are ran correctly with little to no errors to avoid rebuilding, to avoid contradictions, and to avoid case adjustments. You know that you've done your job correctly as the first speaker when there is little need for your deputy to rebuild and adjust the case just because of the response that comes from your from the opposing team's leader of opposition or their deputy prime minister, right? So you need to have good argument identification, good content prioritization, and you need to be very disciplined with the words that you use to build the model and the argument, right? Because the worst thing that could happen to a team, one of the worst things, is to be backloaded, um, which is a term that a lot of debaters use in AP, which just simply means that the most important arguments come from deputy or whip instead. The most important argument should come from you. And deputy is there to debunk a lot of the case that comes from the opposing team. And whip is supposed to clarify why your case is the most important case in the debate. So again, you need to get the content out and you need to get it right the first time. That is the key, in my opinion, to winning AP debates as early as prime minister of leader or leader of opposition, right? First time right. But how should that specifically manifest in the way that you conduct yourselves in an AP round? First is team alignment. And what I mean by team alignment is you and your other two teammates should have a common and clear understanding of what the frame is and what the main arguments should be in the debate, right? And that just simply means that you know what the key mechanisms are, how could we defend it, how could we perhaps improve it, and how do we respond to a lot of the common responses that are made against it. Another thing that you should get get right the first time is the frame. Um, Knowing what are the most important frames, why are we running these frames, and how does it manifest to our arguments. And the last one is the model, and in specific, how the model pipelines and builds on the arguments that we use in the debate, right? So the next parts of the lecture would simply just go through the way we do modeling, the way we do framing, and the way that we do arguing. And how could we perhaps, solidify the process of creating a model, creating a frame, and creating an argument? Because those are your bread and butter as the first speaker, no? Okay, so how do we align the model? And in prep, the model and the supporting arguments should be agreed upon by your team in order to support the case down the line. Again, what happens is if your arguments are misaligned and if you don't have a common understanding within your team, it makes it very difficult for you to do the necessary in round adjustments later on because your team wouldn't know what are the points that we need to reinforce, what are the things that we cannot negotiate on later down the line, and that just makes your case that much weaker because you don't know what are the most important legs that your teammates have to defend, right? And this includes, aligning the model includes selecting and agreeing with your team what model we should run. Do we run the status quo or do we run an alternative world, right? And that's a question that you already must ask yourself, especially if you're in opposition, right? And in a policy debate, because your team will live and die on the model that you guys propose. Even in Gov, right? You have to defend that model. And in order to articulate the model that will come from your team, you need to just ask yourself a few questions. First, what are the specific problems that are being experienced in status quo, right? What is the most glaring problem that is relevant to the motion that we're talking about? You need to know what the problem is. Because if you don't, then your case has no urgency. That makes your argument and that makes your model that less compelling for the judge. Because they won't know why you're arguing this. They don't know why this is important if you don't specifically point out what the problem is, right? What specific changes will our model make? How do we solve the problem that we talked about or that we proposed, right? And how and what are these changes? Basically, what changes? The third is why would these changes happen? And I think this is where 80% of the model really comes from, aside from problem identification, right? Is why does the world or why does this the model react a certain way? Why does it happen like that? What are the incentives? What's the capacity of the actors that we identify in the debate in order for the impact of the model to be in that way? In order for the model to solve the problem that we set. And then last is what direct impact does it make? Right? What changes? How does it benefit the most vulnerable actor that we're talking about? That should be part of the model already. And the tip here is um, specifically the way we do modeling. And I know it might make you sound more credulous if you just had a very heavy model. But to guide you, don't just model for the sake of modeling. You need to create the model in such a way that you're able to you need to create the model in a specific and nuanced manner. And the reasoning behind that is so that you can derive the necessary mechanisms for you to base your arguments on. So again, a good model in the debate is able to seamlessly integrate itself to the arguments and mechanisms that you run at first speaker. Right? So your model should help you create your arguments, and your arguments should be able to impact the arguments are driven by the model that is proposed by your team, right? So that's perhaps the biggest support that you could give to an argument. if you have a very solid model. And I think another supportive factor to the model is the frame. So let's do framing. And a lot of people ask, what is framing really? How is it different from an argument? And in my opinion, a frame is an argument, but how it's different from your usual argument is that to frame the debate is to simply show the judge what the most important parts of the debate are. Because the universe of a debate motion is rather huge. And if you are able to, and if you navigate that debate without any specific lens, you would get lost with what the most important values are. What framing does is to show to the judge, out of all of these people, out of all of these worlds, out of all of these versions of the debate, this is the most important one where most of the change happens and where our team is more likely to win, right? So think of the frame as a literal frame that magnifies the most important part of the debate in such a way that is beneficial to your side. So a frame guides the arguments, guides you to have a more specific argument, a more relevant argument. But, and I know this is quite tempting, too often, first speakers, out of the fear of being seen as arguing randomly, would spend upwards of 3 minutes of their 7 valuable minutes framing. This is often unnecessary. A lot of the times, the framing that we do will simply not be contended by the opposing team, such as maybe like a very obvious definition, right? That just wouldn't be contended by the opposing team because that's also necessary for them to run their arguments. So the guiding principle here is prioritize framing things that your opponents are likely to disagree with you, right? So maybe it's like, are the actors that we're talking about here capable or not? That is often a very contentious definition that you have to frame out already. Versus, let's say, um, middle class Filipinos are likely to not afford the expenses that is necessary to live a comfortable life in the Philippines. That is something that both teams can likely agree towards. But the other thing is more contentious, so focus on the more contentious one. More specifically, when framing the debate, you need to consider one, and this is how you do framing already. What is the context of the debate that we're talking about? What is the time? What is the place? What is the situation? So you need to give a situationer to your judge to show, um, you know, why should we think about the debate in a specific way, in this specific way. Next is, where is this debate most crucial? And it doesn't have to be a literal place, although especially in IR, it most definitely is a specific place, but it can be a certain point in time or a certain point in the stage of the lives of the actors that we have identified, a certain point in time of this country, or a certain decision point for a person or a group of individuals, right? So it's not a literal place, it's a specific moment in which this debate is the most crucial and the most contentious. That is what should be clear from the framing. Third, who are the people that are likely to be affected by this debate the most? This is your simple actor analysis, most vulnerable actor that you guys are probably too tired to listen to already. But again, think about the people. Think about the ones that are likely to be most affected when this debate falls or when this debate stands. And the last part, or one of the last of the many guiding questions that you could explore for yourself is, how do these individuals and systems react towards something? This is your incentive analysis, this is your characterization, and this is a more specific form of context settings that takes into account how a system and how individuals and how groups of people behave, right? And yeah, that's essentially some of the questions that you can ask in framing. But a good piece of framing, right? Hold on. A good piece of framing is able to complement the mechanisms that you give and is able to prop up the relevance of your argument. Because again, if you have a good frame, you don't have to spend so much time um, proving why your argument is relevant because the frame is already supposed to do that. But again, in order to prevent spending too much time framing, think of what are parts of the frame that could be directly integrated to my arguments instead. And often these can be characterizations of individuals, why they are going to behave a certain way, are things that are more beneficial if you were directly putting them under your argument rather than the frame, when the frame should be about context setting and intuition pumps that puts your judge at a certain mood and makes them look at the debate from a certain perspective. That is the purpose of a frame. Last is arguing. And how do you argue right? First is on argument selection. When you want to think of what is the argument that comes from you, and people that have trained with me quite recently um, know that I'm quite fond of the term the main argument. What is the main argument? When thinking of the main argument to run, you need to consider this question. What is the most direct, exclusive change that will happen on my side of the debate in specific, right? What is, I don't know, the most direct consequence of the motion or the policy or whatever it is we're debating in the debate? And why is that only likely to happen on my side? That's when you know that this is the main argument, when it is direct and when it is exclusive, right? Because it takes less brain power to, you know, um, to build the argument and to communicate to the judge that this is the exclusive argument. Or if you think you're one of those people who thinks that principled arguments are separate from pragmatic arguments, to a lot of people who think that they're quite similar, and often that differentiation is not crucial. You can ask yourself, what is the most important obligation that this individual or this group or these people must adhere towards? Like paternalistic responsibility or utilitarianism or virtue ethics, right? And why can that value be only catered to my side of the debate exclusively? Or why does the other side violate that principle? Again, quite simple. And I think great arguments are simple. A good argument, and this is what should be present within your argument, first, is easy to understand what the benefit is. So often in the signposting or the way you labeled your arguments, the most important benefit should already be obvious at the first sentence that you launch the argument on. Second, a good argument has mechanisms that are clear, direct, detailed, and easy to follow. Again, these mechanisms are already derived from the model and the frames that you launched at first speaker. They should be clear in a sense that we know where it's leading to. We know the reasons behind it. Direct in a sense that it is easily connectable from the previous line of logic and from the main premise that you give at first. Detailed in such a way that you're able to show to the judge the specific moving parts that makes the logical links that much more solid in the mind of the judge, right? So if you have to drill down to the most interactional part of the debate, that is how an individual responds to a certain action, then perhaps drill it down to that level. But last is easy to follow, right? Even if you run 16 structural reasons, if that is necessary, a judge should be able to write that down on paper quite nicely, no? Because if they're not able to do that, then that's a useless mechanism. Third, a good argument has impacts that are obviously relevant. Again, guided by your frame, but also because you're able to reiterate what the bottom line of that argument is and what it truly means for the actors that you've identified. Last, a good argument is reasonably preemptive with those preemptions already directly integrated to the way you build the argument. So you don't just build arguments alone. You think of what are possible responses and how could I prepare from those for those responses in the way that I build the reasons. So that is how you can be preemptive in an argument. The preemptions have to be integrated. So that's it. The last part of this lecture, again, quite short, right? Are just simply the tips that I want to leave behind. Um, and these are not just for first speakers. I think this is for everyone in general. And if you want to generally improve in debate. First is never, never, never neglect the simple arguments. You don't have to be smart. You don't have to be clever. Not every round needs a 4D chess argument to win. And this might be more crucial in BP, I'll admit. Because in BP, if you focus too much on the more complex, more difficult argument, the way for closing team to win is to simply run the simple argument and run it quite well. But this is also true for AP because often the most simple argument creates the most consistent, the cleanest, and the most persuasive case for the judge, right? So if the policy is just simply lessening the amount of illiterate and uneducated individuals, let's say it's an education motion, let's say like K to 12. K to 12 lessens unemployment and increases the literacy rate among teens. That is a very simple claim. But if you run that well, if you're able to claim that benefit, that is essentially debate winning. So often, the debate winning case is just simply right under our noses. And we just think that we're beyond that argument. So you need to have that humility and discipline to run the simple case. Because it is the simple case. I promise this. That would make you win the debate and that would make you a much, much better speaker. So be comfortable with the foundations. Be comfortable with the direct and simple arguments. The second part is to argue honestly and realistically. And I just want to stress this out because often I've seen a lot of debaters just be in denial with the extent of their argument. They would say that this outcome wouldn't happen in their world. When if you think about it in an intuitive sense, and if you use your common sense, it will happen. So let's not fool ourselves, no? Let's not delude ourselves that we have the brain power to erase the gravity of the earth. Let's argue honestly. And when I say argue honestly, argue in good faith because that is the best way you can avoid bad faith responses. If you know the limits and the bounds of the argument that you run, if you know, for example, that the policy that you're proposing at Gov is not gonna instantly or it's not gonna completely uplift the lives of the marginalized, be honest with that limit and work towards it, no? So that you're able to magnify the most crucial and no frills, no bullshit part of the benefit of the argument and just focus on that. Um, because if you're going to be dishonest with the way you build reasons, that just opens you to more vulnerable responses that the opposing teams can make against you. So argue in good faith, right? Don't just argue something to be true because an actor is incompetent or an actor is evil and they will always be evil. Argue realistically. These are complex things, complex individuals with complex concerns, but these are the things that matter to them, and these are the things that are more proximate to them, so they are more likely to react in this certain way. And often this is more of a vibe, but you'll know when you're arguing in a good faith and if you're not arguing in a good faith. So
always take the high road, because it really pays off. Because a good, honest, and realistic argument would need a more bespoke response in order for it to be taken down. And that is the way to boost your speaks. So I'm glad I was able to get that out. And that is something that I want to challenge every debater to do. To have a more honest form of conversation. Because again, debate's really just about finding common ground, finding the truth, and I know the competitions demand you to be more competitive and just get every chance you get. But often staying true to the core of debate makes you a better competitor, no? And the last part, the last tip is just as the first speaker, just because you're done speaking, doesn't mean that the round is over. And again, because AP prioritizes consistency and case evolution, you need to have all hands on deck. Um, help your deputy think of responses. Help your whip clarify the readjustments that are made and bring back some of the things that you brought up at first. So help each other out. Create responses, create arguments, and just be there for each other mid round. That's how you can have a good adjustment. So that's it for my very short lecture. I hope you've learned a thing or two. Getting it the first time right, running the right frame, running the right model, running the model in such a way that directly integrates into the mechanisms that you run in the debate. Arguing right, arguing simply, arguing honestly, arguing realistically. These are just some of the values that I think made me a decently successful, experienced first speaker because this is one of the roles that I really loved ever since the day that I started debating. And I hope you guys treat it with the same duty, not duty, with the same discipline, um, to bring forward. Because some of the most compelling arguments really come from you guys, and I want you guys to appreciate that role that you have, embrace it, and do it well. That's it. Thank you so much for listening to this lecture. Best of luck to PIDC and to other tournaments that you might be listening to this lecture for. I hope you've learned something. And again, have a great day. Thank you so much.